The Vampire of Cinkota, the Béla Kiss story. In the quiet suburb of Cinkota, just outside Budapest in the twilight years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a respectable tinsmith lived an unremarkable life. Béla Kiss was known to his neighbors as a quiet, well-liked craftsman who kept to himself and ran a successful business. But behind the facade of middle-class respectability lay one of Europe's most methodical and horrifying serial killers. Between 1900 and 1916, Kiss would murder at least 24 people, preserving their bodies in metal drums filled with alcohol, a macabre collection that would only be discovered by accident during World War I. This is the story of the man who became known as the Vampire of Cinkota, a killer whose ultimate fate remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The early 1900s marked the final decades of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire, a multi-ethnic realm stretching across Central Europe. In Hungary, traditional rural life was giving way to industrialization and modernization, creating new opportunities for those willing to adapt. Cities like Budapest were expanding rapidly, while smaller communities like Cinkota maintained their village character despite their proximity to the imperial capital. This was an era when personal communication relied heavily on newspapers and postal services. Matrimonial advertisements were common, offering lonely hearts a chance to find companionship in an increasingly complex world. The relative anonymity of modern life meant that people could disappear without immediate notice, especially women who lived alone or far from family. It was into this world of opportunity and isolation that Béla Kiss would weave his deadly web, exploiting the trust of vulnerable women seeking love and companionship. His crimes would span nearly 2 decades, hidden behind the respectable facade of a successful businessman in a community where no one suspected the horror unfolding in their midst. Béla Kiss was born around 1877 in Izzak, a small town in Austria-Hungary, to János Kiss and Verona Varga. Little is known about his early childhood, though some sources suggest he may have had an inappropriate relationship with his mother, a disturbing detail that, if true, could help explain his later pathological behavior toward women. By 1900, Kiss had settled in Cinkota, then a separate town near Budapest but now incorporated into the city itself. He established himself as a skilled tinsmith, a respectable trade that provided him with both a steady income and the metalworking skills that would later prove crucial to his crimes. The 1907 assessment from Magyar Nemzet painted a picture of a model citizen. Béla Kiss, a tinsmith in Cinkota, unmarried, lives in a furnished apartment, has his own business as a tinsmith, is regularly employed by his business partners. He is of good character. He is not in debt. He was not insolvent. He always fulfills his obligations. His lifestyle is solid, can be offered for credit. Kiss was married twice and had 2 children, daughters named Aranka and Ilonka. He developed interests beyond his trade, becoming an amateur astrologer with a fascination for occult practices. These interests would later take on sinister significance as investigators tried to understand the ritualistic aspects of his crimes. In 1912, Kiss's life took a dramatic turn when his wife reportedly abandoned him for another man. This betrayal appears to have triggered something dark within Kiss, transforming him from a cuckolded husband into a systematic predator. Following his wife's departure, he hired a housekeeper named Mrs. Jakubek to maintain his household, a decision that would prove crucial to the eventual discovery of his crimes. Mrs. Jakubek quickly noticed that Kiss maintained an extensive correspondence with numerous women. He would place advertisements in newspapers, sometimes offering his services as a matrimonial agent helping others find love, other times presenting himself as a fortune teller capable of divining their romantic futures. These advertisements were carefully crafted to attract specific types of women, those who were vulnerable, isolated, and unlikely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. The housekeeper observed that women would occasionally visit Kiss's home individually, but she had little direct contact with these visitors. What she didn't realize was that she was witnessing the final moments of these women's lives, as each visitor was lured to Cinkota under false pretenses, only to meet a violent end at the hands of their seemingly respectable host. Kiss's approach to murder was methodical and financially motivated. Through his newspaper advertisements, he targeted middle-aged women who were seeking marriage or companionship, women who often lived alone and had accumulated some wealth through inheritance, work, or previous marriages. He was particularly careful to select victims who had no close relatives nearby and no social connections that would quickly notice their disappearance. The process always began the same way. Kiss would woo his victims through romantic correspondence, convincing them to send him money as proof of their commitment or to cover travel expenses for their eventual meeting. Some women became suspicious of these requests and even initiated court proceedings against Kiss for fraud. However, both of these women subsequently disappeared, and their cases were dismissed when they failed to appear in court. When the women finally came to visit Kiss in Cinkota, expecting to meet their future husband or have their fortunes told, they instead encountered death. Kiss would strangle each victim, then employ his skills as a tinsmith to preserve their bodies in large metal drums filled with alcohol. This preservation technique would keep the bodies from decomposing and emitting odors that might alert neighbors to what was happening on his property. As Kiss's killing spree continued, neighbors began to notice the growing collection of metal drums on his property. When curious townspeople questioned him about these containers, Kiss was ready with a plausible explanation. He claimed they contained gasoline that he was stockpiling in preparation for the rationing that would inevitably come with the approaching war. This explanation satisfied the authorities and neighbors, as it seemed entirely reasonable for a practical businessman to prepare for wartime shortages. The drums were stored in a chamber next to Kiss's workshop, where they appeared to contain nothing more threatening than fuel reserves. In reality, each drum contained the alcohol-preserved corpse of one of his victims. Mrs. Jakubek, while maintaining Kiss's household, was strictly forbidden from entering certain areas of the property. Kiss had established a locked room that he told her never to enter under any circumstances. This room would later be revealed to contain the evidence of his extensive planning and research into methods of murder, as well as correspondence with dozens of potential victims. When World War I erupted in 1914, Kiss was conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army, leaving his house in Mrs. Jakubek's care. His departure seemed to mark the end of his killing spree, as no new victims disappeared during his military service. However, his absence would also lead to the accidental discovery that would expose the full scope of his crimes. Kiss's military service provided him with the perfect cover for his eventual disappearance. In the chaos of World War I, soldiers frequently went missing, died in battle, or were taken prisoner. For someone planning to vanish permanently, military service offered numerous opportunities to assume a new identity or simply fade into the massive casualty lists of the Great War. In May 1916, nearly 2 years after Kiss had left for the war, his landlord Martin Krasinski decided to renovate the building Kiss had rented. Accompanied by his old acquaintance Béla Kiss, a local pharmacist, Krasinski went to Cinkota to assess what materials might be available for the renovation project. The two men entered the chamber next to Kiss's workshop, expecting to find reeds that Kiss remembered seeing there previously. Instead, they discovered 7 large metal drums, each measuring about 1 meter long and 50 centimeters wide. The airtight top of the uppermost barrel had been loosened, and when they pried it open, a terrible stench filled the chamber. What they found inside defied comprehension. Sewn into a bag within the drum was the body of a woman, preserved in alcohol. When they opened a second barrel, the same horrifying discovery awaited them. Krasinski and Kiss immediately contacted the authorities, setting in motion an investigation that would reveal one of Hungary's most shocking criminal cases. Chief Notary Gyula Huska arrived with police officers to investigate the discovery. A thorough search of Kiss's property revealed the staggering scope of his crimes. A total of 24 bodies were found, 23 women and 1 man, all preserved in metal drums filled with alcohol. The victims had been strangled, and many showed puncture marks on their necks where their blood had been drained. The famous Austro-Hungarian author Frigyes Karinthy was present during the investigation and described the methodical horror of the scene. "I stood there in the cemetery in Cinkota, in front of the tin barrels, and watched one by one as the contents of the opened barrels were poured out onto the autopsy table. Tin barrels of different heights, equally tinned, precisely, with conscientious work. This is how a proper, precise collector works, one who understands his craft and likes order." The systematic nature of Kiss's preservation method revealed a killer who approached murder with the same meticulous attention to detail he brought to his tinsmith trade. Each body had been carefully prepared and sealed in its container, creating a macabre collection that spoke to both his technical skills and his complete dehumanization of his victims. Detective Nog, who led the investigation, immediately contacted military authorities to locate and arrest Kiss if he was still alive. Given that Kiss was a common Hungarian surname, this proved challenging, but Nog was determined to bring the killer to justice. He also arrested Mrs. Jakubek for questioning, suspecting she might have been involved in the murders, especially since Kiss had left her money in his will. However, Jakubek convinced police of her innocence and led them to Kiss's secret locked room. Inside, investigators found an extensive library focused on poisons and strangulation methods, along with a desk containing correspondence with 74 different women. A photo album documented his victims, and the letters revealed the full scope of his fraudulent matrimonial scheme. The investigation revealed that Kiss's criminal activities dated back to at least 1903, based on the oldest letters in his correspondence. The methodical way he had documented his crimes suggested someone who took pride in his work and wanted to preserve evidence of his accomplishments. This narcissistic aspect of his personality would prove crucial to understanding both his motivations and his methods. The 74 letters found in Kiss's possession told tragic stories of lonely women seeking companionship and finding only death. Kiss had specifically targeted middle-aged women who lived alone and had accumulated some wealth. His advertisements in matrimonial columns attracted women from across the region who believed they had found a caring partner. Each victim represented more than just a statistic in Kiss's criminal ledger. They were women who had hoped for love, companionship, or simply guidance about their futures. Instead, they found themselves face to face with a predator who saw them only as sources of money and objects for his twisted preservation experiments. The discovery that victims' bodies had been drained of blood, combined with puncture marks on their necks, led investigators to speculate that Kiss might have been practicing vampirism. This theory was supported by his known interest in occult practices and astrology, suggesting a killer who might have believed his crimes served some supernatural purpose. Whether Kiss actually consumed his victim's blood or simply drained it as part of his preservation process remains unclear. However, the systematic nature of the blood draining, combined with the careful preservation of the bodies, suggested ritual aspects to his crimes that went beyond mere murder for financial gain. The vampiric elements of Kiss's crimes captured public imagination and added to the horror of the case. In an era when belief in supernatural forces remained strong, the possibility that a real vampire was operating in suburban Budapest terrified the public and added mystique to an already shocking case. On October 4, 1916, Detective Nog received a letter indicating that Kiss was recuperating in a Serbian hospital, recovering from war wounds. This seemed like the break investigators needed to finally apprehend the killer and bring him to justice. Nagy immediately made arrangements to travel to Serbia and arrest Kiss. However, when Nagy arrived at the hospital, he discovered that Kiss had fled, leaving behind the corpse of another soldier in his bed. This daring escape demonstrated both Kiss's cunning and his preparation for the possibility that his crimes would eventually be discovered. The substitution of another soldier's body suggested careful planning and possibly accomplices within the military. Nagy alerted all Hungarian police about Kiss's escape, but the subsequent investigation of alleged sightings proved fruitless. The chaos of World War I provided perfect cover for someone seeking to disappear permanently, and Kiss seemed to have vanished into the enormous population of displaced persons, deserters, and refugees that the war had created. Speculation arose that Kiss had orchestrated his escape by switching identities with a dead soldier named Macquarie. This theory suggested a level of premeditation that indicated Kiss had always planned for the possibility of discovery and had prepared multiple escape routes and false identities. The identity switch theory was supported by the discovery of the substitute corpse in Kiss's hospital bed. In the massive casualty lists of World War I, one dead soldier could easily be mistaken for another, especially if someone had access to military records and the opportunity to manipulate them. Kiss's reported wounds may have been fabricated to justify his hospitalization and provide cover for his escape plan. In the years following Kiss's escape, numerous sightings and rumors circulated about his whereabouts. Some reports suggested he had been imprisoned for burglary in Romania, while others claimed he had died of yellow fever in Turkey. These conflicting stories demonstrated both the public fascination with the case and the difficulty of tracking someone who had successfully assumed a new identity. In 1920, a significant lead emerged when a soldier in the French Foreign Legion reported on a fellow legionnaire named Hoffman, a name Kiss had used in some of his correspondence. This legionnaire supposedly matched Kiss's description and had boasted about his skill with a garrote, the weapon that might have been used to strangle his victims. However, when authorities attempted to investigate, Hoffman had deserted from the Foreign Legion, once again staying one step ahead of justice. This pattern of near captures followed by disappearances suggested either remarkable luck or careful monitoring of law enforcement activities. The most intriguing and final reported sighting of Béla Kiss occurred in New York City in 1932, 16 years after his disappearance from the Serbian hospital. Detective Henry Oswald of the New York Police Department reported that he was certain he had seen Kiss emerging from the subway at Times Square in Manhattan. According to this account, Kiss was allegedly living in New York City and working as a janitor, maintaining the anonymous working-class existence that would allow him to blend into the city's massive immigrant population. The choice of janitorial work would have provided him with access to buildings and relative anonymity, perfect cover for someone hiding from an international manhunt. When police attempted to locate and interview the suspected janitor, he had already disappeared, leaving no trace of his presence or destination. Whether this was actually Kiss or simply another case of mistaken identity remains unknown, but it represented the last credible sighting of one of Europe's most wanted men. Béla Kiss's ultimate fate remains one of criminology's great unsolved mysteries. Did he successfully escape to America and live out his days as an anonymous immigrant worker? Did he die during his military service, with all subsequent sightings being cases of mistaken identity? Or did he continue killing under a new name in a new country, never to be connected with his crimes in Hungary? The sophisticated planning evident in his escape suggests someone who had prepared for discovery and had multiple contingency plans. Kiss had demonstrated remarkable cunning in his original crimes, maintaining his deadly activities for over a decade while presenting himself as a respectable businessman. This same intelligence would have served him well in evading capture. The fact that no similar crimes were reported in the areas where Kiss was allegedly sighted raises questions about whether he continued killing or simply lived quietly under his assumed identity. Perhaps the chaos and trauma of World War I had changed him, or perhaps he had satisfied whatever compulsions had driven him to murder. The Kiss case represented one of the early examples of methodical evidence collection and analysis in European criminal investigations. Detective Nagy's careful examination of Kiss's correspondence provided crucial insights into the killer's methodology and victim selection process. The preservation of the bodies in alcohol, while horrifying, actually aided the investigation by preventing decomposition and allowing for detailed forensic examination. This examination revealed the systematic nature of Kiss's crimes and provided evidence of the ritualistic blood draining that suggested vampiric practices. The discovery of Kiss's personal library, filled with books about poisons and strangulation, demonstrated premeditation and research that went far beyond crimes of passion. This evidence painted a picture of a killer who approached murder as a craft to be studied and perfected, much like his legitimate work as a tinsmith. The Béla Kiss case had a profound impact on Hungarian society and contributed to growing awareness of the dangers posed by anonymous correspondence and matrimonial fraud. The case highlighted the vulnerability of women living alone and seeking companionship through newspaper advertisements. Kiss's story has inspired numerous works of fiction and drama, including Antonin Artaud's play 32 and various modern horror films and novels. The combination of vampiric elements, methodical preservation of victims, and his mysterious disappearance has made Kiss a figure of enduring fascination in true crime literature. The case also contributed to the development of modern investigative techniques, particularly in the areas of correspondence analysis and geographic profiling. Nagi's systematic approach to examining Kiss's letters and tracking his movements became a model for future investigations of serial crimes. Modern psychological analysis of Kiss's crimes reveals a killer who combined financial motivation with deeper psychological compulsions. His systematic preservation of victims suggests both practical concerns about disposing of bodies and possible necrophilic tendencies that drove him to maintain relationships with his dead victims. The fact that Kiss was triggered by his wife's abandonment suggests someone with profound issues around rejection and control. His subsequent targeting of women seeking love and companionship may have represented a twisted form of revenge against the gender he blamed for his emotional pain. The ritualistic aspects of his crimes, including the blood draining and careful preservation, suggest someone who had developed elaborate fantasies around death and control. Kiss's interest in the occult may have provided a framework for these fantasies, allowing him to justify his actions as serving some supernatural purpose. The discovery of Kiss's crimes devastated the families of his victims, many of whom had spent years wondering what had happened to their missing relatives. The revelation that these women had died while seeking love and companionship added cruelty to an already tragic situation. Mrs. Jakubek, Kiss's housekeeper, was particularly traumatized by the discovery that she had been living so close to such horror without realizing it. Her testimony proved crucial to the investigation, but she also had to live with the knowledge that she had been sharing a house with multiple corpses for years. The case also affected the broader community of Cinkota, where residents had to reconcile their image of Kiss as a quiet, respectable neighbor with the reality of his crimes. The discovery that such evil could hide behind such an ordinary facade shook the community's sense of security and trust. Modern criminologists continue to study the Kiss case, both for its historical significance and for the insights it provides into serial killer behavior. The methodical nature of his crimes and the extensive documentation he maintained make it a valuable case study for understanding how killers develop and refine their techniques. Cold case investigators have occasionally revisited the various sightings and leads from the decades following Kiss's disappearance, but no new evidence has emerged to definitively resolve his fate. The passage of time has made verification impossible, leaving his ultimate destiny as one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Some modern analysts believe that Kiss's apparent cessation of killing, if the lack of similar crimes in his alleged hiding places is accurate, suggests either death or a fundamental change in his psychology. The trauma of war and the stress of maintaining a false identity might have been sufficient to suppress his homicidal compulsions. Today, more than a century after Béla Kiss's crimes were discovered, his story continues to fascinate and horrify in equal measure. The quiet suburb of Cinkota has long since been absorbed into Budapest, and new buildings have replaced the workshop where Kiss conducted his grisly experiments. But the questions his case raises about trust, vulnerability, and the evil that can hide behind ordinary facades remain as relevant as ever. Kiss's 24 victims were women who believed they had found someone who understood their loneliness and could offer them companionship in an often harsh world. Instead, they encountered a predator who saw them only as objects to be exploited, murdered, and preserved like specimens in his private museum of death. The story of Béla Kiss is more than a tale of individual evil. It's a chilling reminder of how predators exploit our most basic human needs for love and connection. In an age before background checks and digital verification, his victims had only their instincts and his carefully crafted letters to guide them. They trusted, and they died for that trust. True crime isn't just about the monsters who emerge from the shadows. It's about the systems that allow them to flourish and the societies that fail to protect the vulnerable. We tell these stories not to sensationalize evil, but to honor the memory of those whose only crime was seeking human connection. Kiss's victims were daughters, sisters, women with hopes and dreams who deserved better than to become entries in a killer's catalog of preserved corpses. Their names may be lost to history, but their stories remind us that behind every crime statistic is a human being whose life had value and meaning. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think about the trust we place in strangers, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Weird World Wonders. Every click helps us honor the forgotten victims of history's darkest chapters and ensures their stories continue to be told with the dignity they deserve. Because in the end, the greatest victory over evil isn't catching the killer. It's refusing to let the victims be forgotten. In remembering their stories, we keep their humanity alive and perhaps prevent others from meeting the same fate.